So a quick about ANAC. ANAC was founded in 1987 and has really been working towards that mission since. And a huge part of that has to create an effective network of nurses. As we know, there's so many nurses around the globe, and we don't always have the time to really discuss and take time to share information or knowledge from different parts of the world. And a big part of what ANAC does is really try to support that facilitation, and that includes studying, researching, and exchanging information and experiences that leads to the improved care of persons with HIV, and living with HIV or at risk. And so we are so excited to be having this today because all of this fits so directly well into the mission that ANAC has, and us as the global committee who are very interested in making sure that we are doing this not just, where ANAC is based here in the US, but also globally, about making sure that we can reach out to professionals around the world and have them, like Dr. CJ, and have them share what their experiences has been so that we can learn from one another. So if you are interested in becoming an ANAC member, I will be putting a link in the bio. A link in the webinar chat for us to be able to, for you to be able to look into. It'll also be in the follow-up coming shortly. Some quick housekeeping notes before we begin. There is no NCPD for this particular webinar, so there is sometimes ANAC does offer continuing education credits. In this particular webinar, we will not be offering that. We encourage for participants to remain muted, but then also if you have any questions, we do want this to be interactive. We want to be able to hear from you all, and you took the time to be here with us today. So feel free to raise your hand so we can hear what you have to say. And also, please feel free to type any questions or comments into the question pane or dashboard, and we'll make sure that they get addressed. So a quick overview of kind of the things that we're really looking to cover today is just occupational violence is something that is quite serious, and also something that we've noted, as Ellen said, is an interest within the nursing profession, is understanding that it's a prevalent challenge across healthcare systems around the world, and exploring how emotional abuse and unacceptable behaviors are also part of that. And so we're so grateful to have Dr. CJ with us today. She has done a lot of research on this and has been involved in some articles around this. And so I think that this being a key part of the nursing experience and being able to talk about how to handle it is going to be very important. And we look forward to your contribution. And then to introduce Dr. CJ, I'm going to pass it over to Noriel. If you could just tell us a little bit about our presenter today, and then we'll switch over so that she can share her slides.
All right, thank you. Well, I tried my best to compress what I do know about CJ. So, Dr. Cara Joyce Cabilan, or CJ as she likes to be called or addressed, is a distinguished leader in the field of nursing, recognized particularly not only for her pioneering work in the area of occupational violence prevention in emergency health settings, in her role as the Director for Occupational Violence Prevention and Management at Canberra Health Services. CJ leads initiatives aimed to enhance the safety of healthcare environments, directly addressing the complex challenges faced by healthcare professionals like nurses in high stress scenarios. Her commitment to this cause is further highlighted by her significant academic contributions, which includes over 427 research articles and 579 citations, underscoring her influence and expertise in the field. She also serves as an adjunct lecturer at the University of Queensland School of Nursing, Midwifery, and Schoolwork, and has been recognized as the Emergency Nurse of the Year in 2022 by the College of Emergency Nurses Australia, a testament to her impact and dedication. Um, as our speaker for the webinar, CJ brings a wealth of knowledge and inspirational leadership, offering profound insights into the prevention and management of occupational violence in healthcare settings. I myself caught myself realizing how pervasive the issue is and how normalized have these things have been in the settings here in the Philippines. Her presence and attendance and expertise today promises to enrich not only the discussion, but hopefully inspire uh, healthcare professionals, nurse leaders to foster safer and more supportive work environments. And without further ado, let us give a warm welcome to our very own Dr. CJ Cabilan, our resource speaker.
Thank you very much for that, Nwei. Although grateful for the intro, but I don't know where you got your 427 articles from. I'd like to say yes, I published that many, but not yet. But not yet. Probably citations, but thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. And I acknowledge the time differences that we all have. It is at the moment 12 past 4 in the afternoon in Canberra. And so yeah, like, thank you for making the time to participate in this webinar. I'm just trying to navigate my screen to try and share my slide, because I think at the moment I'm being shared on screen. And I don't have the option available to me just yet. There you go, found it. Okay. Just doing checks that the slides are visible. Amazing. All right, so let's get started. This time is golden. So I'm hoping to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes about workplace violence or occupational violence, as we like to refer to the term in Australia. So you'll probably hear me interchange the term occupational violence or OV, but they do mean workplace violence. And I thought before I begin a presentation, I will do a acknowledgement of country, as is customary here in Australia. In the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. I pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and extend the respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present today. And I am presenting from Canberra or Ngunnawal country. Just for the disclaimer, all claims or any opinions that are expressed in this webinar are from, they do not represent my organisations, Canberra Health Services and the University of Queensland, and those opinions are opinions and some evidence-based. And I do recognise that OV is upsetting and it is traumatising. And so if anyone from Australia is tuning in today, we do have a 24/7 nurse and midwife support. And the numbers are here, or you can search for the website Nurse and Midwife Support, and that will appear. For those in other parts of the world, please do access your local employee assistance program or have a chat to your mates to get support if you find some of this content upsetting. So a bit of an overview of the talk today. We're going to start with some stats, of course, to try and highlight and emphasise the problem of occupational violence around the globe. And then that will be followed with old versus challenging old ways of thinking to try and shift some of those negative narratives or attitudes around occupational violence. And then lastly, we'll finish up with a slide with the iceberg analogy with a list of existing solutions and are feasible solutions for occupational violence. Okay, so I thought we'll start with an activity and hopefully it works for everybody this time. So get your phones out and scan the QR code. And I truly do hope it works. Please tell me in the chat if it doesn't. And I am really interested, because we try and share experiences here, right? Is what type of occupational violence have you experienced in the last 12 months? All right. So it is very, now the experiences that you've shared are the ones that pretty much aligns with experiences of healthcare workers across the globe. And it is very interesting that somebody had noted psychological violence, and that's exactly something I would really wish to highlight. Because, generally, physical and verbal forms of occupational violence are, what do you call this? The most obvious forms of occupational violence, and they are pretty straightforward. Whereas psychological violence or this emotional blackmail or emotional abuse, these are some of the things that we tend to ignore, but they're actually just as impactful and detrimental to our mental well-being. So what about these behaviors? So we've talked about physical and verbal overview, right? And we segue towards the psychological abuse and emotional abuse. Now, the behaviors that are in front of you, these are some of the behaviors that occur every day. And these are the behaviors that we tend to ignore. So in Australia, we call these unacceptable behaviors, but in the literature, you might find them referred to as psychological abuse or emotional abuse. So these are the behaviors that are frequent and may be labeled as low level. And so therefore we tend to normalize and ignore. But nevertheless, these are the behaviors that are actually just as impactful. So some of these behaviors are, I've experienced rudeness before, sexism, some racist comments, patients with, I don't know if this is a term that's used in your areas, but we call them like splitting behaviors. So this is when patients like talk ill about your colleagues or other staff members. Some of those comments might be disparaging. There might be some undermining or gaslighting behaviors. Some people may make unreasonable demands. So I'll give you a recent example. Somebody had cancelled their appointment and threatened to report us to the minister if we do not accommodate them to a new appointment that actually suits them, or threatening to complain to the board if we don't meet some of their demands. Can anyone think of any other, if you can think of any other behaviors that you've experienced, I'd be really interested to hear about them. And you can drop them in the chat later on. And so the reason why we talk about unacceptable behaviors, and we emphasize that it is part, that it is a form of occupational violence, is that, as I mentioned earlier, they happen every day and may be ignored, maybe normalized, and may be seen as low level. But over time, actually, as we are exposed to these behaviors, the bigger the psychosocial burden is going to be. And so this is what I mean about, yes, they're low level, but they are just as impactful. Because over time, the intensity of that psychosocial burden gets greater, because these are the behaviors that we get exposed to most of the time. Okay, so the stats that you see in front of you, it's a harmonized data from 6 continents showing the prevalence of occupational violence against healthcare workers. Now, noting that at the moment, what really counts as occupational violence is predominantly physical and verbal occupational violence. So I imagine, and I could only estimate, that the prevalence is actually much greater if you factor in unacceptable behaviors. And also when you factor in underreporting, that is, also prevalent around health services across the globe. So this harmonized data is showing us that on average, about 6 to 7 in 10 healthcare workers experienced occupational violence in the last 12 months. And what the data actually shows is that violence occurs no matter how resourced or advanced a country is. And some of these stats also show us that the higher risk areas are emergency services or ambulance, emergency department, mental health settings or psychiatric settings, as well as aged care. Now, we pay attention to occupational violence, not just because how common it is, but also because the costs that it actually the fiscal impact of occupational violence in healthcare services. So these numbers are in, I believe I've already converted them to Australian dollars, and the dollar value was around 2020, I think. So it costs about 215,000 in sick leave, about $500,000 in terms of restraints, response to OV in acute settings. That's with in Australia, in acute settings, we have an emergency call called Code Black, and that's part of the cost. And I believe in North America, it's called Code White. And the estimate of productivity costs of occupational violence is actually around, and so that's, absenteeism, presenteeism, sick leave, and turnover. Now, putting the numbers aside, right, because we are people, I am interested, we'll try and humanize the impacts of occupational violence. For those who have said that they've experienced occupational violence in the last 12 months, I would like to hear your experience on how did the incident affect you. Can I just check that on your screen you can see the live results, correct? Just a thumbs. Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Wow. So again, your experience is sadly not unique, and this is consistent with what other healthcare workers have been saying around the globe in how violence impacts them. And so it doesn't only result in physical injuries, and I think the public generally thinks that, but occupational violence is detrimental to our mental well-being. As you have reported here, it made you feel humiliated, demoralized, vulnerable. It undermines your confidence, and that includes your self-esteem as well. And you lose interest. And does that mean that we lose interest in the nursing workforce? Because who wants to be a nurse, right? If you actually really try your best, you go to work, you do your best every day, and you get abused. Because sometimes too, I think it's the nature of us humans that even if you look after, let's say, 5 to 6 people in a day, all it takes is that one negative comment about you and about your work, and that's what sticks with you. And some reason you disregard the 5 other positive comments, and it's that unacceptable behavior that really stays with you, not just for the day, but the week or months. And these are some of the things that linger. Now, because of the impacts of occupational violence on individuals, right? Nurses are actually leaving the workforce. So the impetus, the motivation to prevent occupational violence is therefore to also save the nursing workforce. Now, because occupational violence, it increases our intention to leave, our desire to leave. And in fact, I've had close colleagues who have left the emergency department because of occupational violence, in search for a better profession, like have actually left nursing, not just the emergency department. And, a close friend of mine, is now studying business administration because they feel like, they can't do healthcare anymore because of occupational violence. And so that's the impact of the existing workforce. What about future workforce? Well, occupational violence also influences people's decision to enter the workforce. So if we have people leaving, not enough people are filling in those places, then we really are in trouble, aren't we, as a nursing workforce? Okay, so I'll use a different analogy now, right? Just to try and really reiterate the importance of occupational violence prevention. So this is a healthcare system with nurses. Now imagine the apples are healthcare, and these people reaching for it is the population. They are the population that we serve. And the ladders, that's us nurses. And so what this means is that we enable people to attain healthcare. And so if nurses are leaving the workforce because of occupational violence, this is what happens in the healthcare system. It makes healthcare less attainable for people. And so when we have this condition, we know that some of the drivers of people's frustration are, wait times, cancellation, not enough staff, then it further fuels the problem. Now, up to this point, all I've talked about are problems. And so you really must be interested in solutions now, I hope. Now, there is no silver bullet. There's no magic wands to how we can solve occupational violence. But one thing that I do offer to people, to nurses, when I actually talk to them, and particularly in work areas, is the very first thing that we really need to do is change our culture. Now, a lot of our culture is influenced by the way we think and the way we act. So I reckon that to prevent occupational violence, we must first change the way we think about it, because we do need to cultivate a culture that reports occupational violence, that challenges the status quo that occupational violence is not okay, and to some extent it actually is criminal. And we need to cultivate a culture of action and escalation to your line managers or even to your leadership, that you do have a duty of care. While health services have a duty of care to patients, as an employer, they actually have a duty of care to provide a safe and favorable workplace. And so in the next several slides, hopefully I can help shift some of those attitudes that we may help. Okay, so the first one is the first unhelpful thinking or attitude is it's not occupational violence because no one was hurt. Now, this is quite common that some nurses don't report, or some nurses don't just say, oh, that was fine, he was just being rude. Or, oh, that's fine, he was just being passive aggressive. Or that's fine, he just swore at me. So as Noi mentioned earlier, that these are some of the things that we actually normalize. But because we don't call it out, and we think it's okay, then it worsens the problem. And so a helpful way to think about it is that it is occupational violence when it's targeted towards you, and it comes in the form of physical or verbal and unacceptable behaviors that has the potential to cause physical or psychosocial harm. I forgot to put the word potential there because I don't want you to think that it has to have a negative impact on you for us to be able to classify it as occupational violence. And always remember that even though if it doesn't impact you there and then, it may impact you in the future as a cumulative effect of some of these behaviors, and also it may have an impact on your colleagues as well. Okay, so the next unhelpful one is occupational violence happens because of lack of education and training of staff. Now, this is really tricky because I bet you some participants today might have experienced previously that when they reported occupational violence, their line managers may have responded that what could you have done better, or possibly have sent you to have some sort of de-escalation training or education training because they felt that you were inadequately prepared for the interaction. Well, the challenge that actually in a more productive way to think about occupational violence is that it's a result of many factors that actually stem from different levels or different layers. So to emphasize that point, I like to use an analogy. This is an iceberg analogy. Now, up the surface is an occupational violence incident, but beneath it, there are actually different driving factors that happen at the same time that drive that incident. So we have context, for example, or the settings in which occupational violence occurs. And so as for context, this is at the organizational level. You know, some organizations may not have training opportunities for staff, or staffing just really inefficiently run system, or security or access control that contributes to it. And of course, you've got situations too that generally stem from lack of or miscommunication, unmet needs or expectations. Bad news is one. So a common example of bad news is, for example, in some settings in Australia, you actually can't smoke within a certain, within the perimeter of the hospital. And so, as you can imagine, when you tell people not to smoke in those areas, or when you can't take them down for a smoke, you can just imagine the fallout from that. And so, bad news does contribute to occupational violence. And I'm not saying it excuses people's behaviors, okay? The reason why I'm showing this is that it helps explain why occupational violence happens in healthcare settings. And you've got staff-related factors. Some staff may have poor interpersonal or communication skills because of the lack of training opportunities, and so we have underprepared staff. As for patient-related factors, we have people who have poor stress tolerance, emotionally dysregulated, people who have cognitive impairment, intoxicated. Some people have, what's overrepresented in cohort studies at the moment is, you got people with schizoaffective disorders. You got people with substance use disorders. And in terms of, you got people with dementia, people with delirium. So these are some of the drivers, patient-related factors that drive occupational violence incidents. And of course, a social context. There are lack of consequences for poor behaviors, and so people think it's okay. And some healthcare settings or some work cultures may have high tolerance for occupational violence. And I placed just a single word at culture, and what that really means is the blame culture, the underreporting culture, and just this culture that actually normalizes OV. And so all these things happen at the same time that contribute to a single incident. And so to actually prevent occupational violence, decision makers, line managers, and even us people on the ground need to be looking at solutions that target specifically of what's driving or what's contributing to occupational violence in your areas. Okay, so the next unhelpful thinking is we need to have zero tolerance to occupational violence. Now, I'm actually opposed to this view of zero tolerance to occupational violence for the reason that I that I discussed in the earlier slide, that there are just too many factors that drive it, and it's really impossible to not have some tolerance to it. And I think it's a lot healthier for healthcare systems to strive for low tolerance to occupational violence rather than zero tolerance. And the reason why I say that is that we have patient-related factors, right, that are driven by mental health, and we also have patient-related factors that are driven by cognitive impairment. And to me, my interpretation of zero tolerance is it just means that we will just dismiss people altogether, that we won't care for them because of their violent behaviors. And so we leave those people very vulnerable in the community without healthcare. Hence why I am a proponent of low tolerance rather than zero tolerance. And the other thing too is that I feel like zero tolerance creates frustration, because OV, and again for the reasons that I highlighted in the iceberg slide, is that it creates frustration because OV will keep happening despite the current controls, and so you're thinking that you're frustrated because you will think that you're failing all the time because OV still happens no matter what you do. And so, and this is why low tolerance is far more productive, and I think a positive way forward for occupational violence prevention. So I've tried to put this in a plane. You probably have noticed now that I really like analogies. I try to supplement words with visuals because I am a visual learner, and I'm sorry also if the colors are a bit off on your screen. But what this plane is actually depicting is where we need to be at in terms of occupational violence. So when we talk about low tolerance, we also need to match that with consequences and interventions. And so ideally, we need to be around here, like the lower parts, where that location pin is. Definitely don't do zero consequences or high tolerance, because that's a recipe for disaster, and you will have a lot of sick leave and you won't have staff to actually care for your patients. So strive for low tolerance and matched with consequences for people who choose violence, as well as interventions or risk controls that enable a safe working environment for both staff and patients. Okay, so the next unhelpful one is, I keep forgetting to correct this slide. The unhelpful thought actually is violence can't be predicted. It just happens. And a more helpful way to actually think about violence is it can be predicted by paying attention to early warning signs. Now, what I mean by that is I'll show you one of the earlier frameworks that contextualizes occupational violence. So the assault cycle, it tells us that violence happens in actually 5 phases, and I've just adapted it to show these 5 phases in front. So we will have a calm baseline, right? Like a reasonably calm baseline. Then we have triggers. So we get triggered by something. And again, it's not excusing people's behaviors. It's explaining why they may behave in such manner. And then you get escalating behaviors as a result of triggers. Then you have the crisis or aggression phase. Then you have the recovery phase. So generally is that we can predict violence by paying attention to escalating behaviors. And I'll tell you more about that. But I just would like to cover some of the common triggers for violence. And the point why an assault cycle is really helpful for us in practice is that if we know the trigger for that person, then obviously that's something that we would really try to mitigate as much as possible, right? Because without triggers, You won't have escalating behaviors. That escalating behaviors, then you won't have aggression. So each phase gives us an opportunity to lower the likelihood of aggression. So starting with triggers, everyone has a different trigger. At the moment, the really common one in healthcare settings is, cancellations, really long wait times, people feeling ignored or deprioritized. We have like a really inefficient healthcare system and some miscommunication as well. Now, going back to the predictability of occupational violence, this is where our risk assessment tools are really helpful, because our risk assessment tools at the moment, you may have heard of the Brosette Violence Checklist, and the one that I was involved in is called the Queensland Occupational Violence Patient Risk Assessment Tool. This is where it's helpful because it's like an early warning system. It looks at these escalating behaviors, and ideally, this is where you need to start de-escalating. You don't de-escalate when people are already angry. You de-escalate when you see early warning signs. And so, because if you de-escalate early, the greater the chances are of success of your verbal de-escalation. Now, if you're de-escalating in the crisis or aggression phase, it lowers your chances of being successful, and people might be more inflamed by what you have to say. Now, as a sort of takeaway, I'd like to share with you a code White's mnemonic, and I'm happy to send this to the attendees today as a bonus for actually making time to be here. I'm happy to send you a PDF copy of this. So this is a mnemonic for basic nonverbal and verbal de-escalation technique. So code White's, code start, each letter obviously stands for something, stands for a technique on what we're meant to do to enhance our chances of a safe and a successful verbal de-escalation when we see early warning signs. So C stands for, being calm, cool, and collected when we approach people, an open body language, and we need to be out of people's swinging or kicking range to avoid being hit. And it's also giving that person space too. And E is always think to engage positively. And the Whites simply follow the assault cycle. Always try and find out what is triggering the person's escalating behaviors. What is triggering their anger or frustration, right? Because remember, that's what we're trying to prevent in the first place. And then H is, let's ask, how do they cool off? Like, how do they normally calm when they're at home? Do they just need time and space? Let's give them that. Do they sometimes need medications? Let's offer them that. Whatever it is, let's ask to, let's always strive to empower that person to take charge of their emotions. And I stands for identifying solutions and options, of course, to provide a way out of anger. And T is to team up with a person, because that's what a verbal de-escalation does. It's an interaction, an engagement between two people. It's not just about you de-escalating. And E is to establish boundaries and limits early by telling the person what is okay and what is not okay, and what they can do to enable a positive and therapeutic interaction. And S, of course, is support and recovery for that person, and of course for your own well-being as well. So that was a very quick rundown, and this is something that this infographic is something that I'm happy to share to the attendees today. All right, so let's say after you've de-escalated, the person is still aggressive, swearing at you, verbally abusive, right? So this is where you can delimit, or this is an opportunity, if you deem safe to do so, to tell the person that their behaviors are unacceptable. So in the health service where I work at, we empower our staff to delimit, and we ask, we use like the ask, warn, act framework. So ask, by asking the person to be respectful. You don't tell them stop being violent or stop yelling at, but you ask them towards, you try and influence them to behave well, to be respectful. And then you warn them of the consequences so they keep going. Then the act part is to disengage, just to walk away and call for help. So an example might be, look, I can help you if you are respectful. And if they keep going, then that's when you can say, I will walk away if you continue to speak to me like that. And act is following through, that if you say you'll walk away, actually walk away. Or if you say, if you keep going, I'm going to call security, actually call security. Or if you call the police, actually call the police, right? Because remember the tolerance plane, that you have to have consequences that matches with your tolerance levels. Because without consequences and interventions, as I mentioned earlier, people are going to be primed or conditioned into thinking that violence against healthcare workers is okay. All right, so the next unhelpful thinking is reporting occupational violence incidents makes no difference. Okay, now, obviously, right, is reporting is very important because they help evidence your safety concern. And also, when you report occupational violence, is that we have greater grasp of the problem and the contributing factors to it. And so therefore, with that knowledge, then we have a greater understanding of why they happen. And so it helps us target solutions for occupational violence, but not just solutions too, is how well our solutions are working. But at the moment, we're not really reporting. And so our solutions are a bit slow, or in some places can be a little bit stagnant. And so going back to the importance of reporting, right? So first importance is, as you've got there in the slides, it helps evidence your staff safety concerns. It helps us escalate matters, and it helps us escalate to pursue legal action if you really need to, for these people to hold people to account, to hold people who choose violence to account, rather. And the other importance of reporting is that it gives us like a better picture, or a more holistic picture of why occupational violence happens, gives us a good understanding of the solutions that we need to try and mitigate risk factors. And the other importance of reporting is, of course, it helps us measure how well our risk controls are working. So the next unhelpful thing that we want to undo is patients cannot be held accountable for assaults or for their actions. So these are the people who choose violence, right? So the truth is, patients can actually be held accountable for their actions, even people with mental illness. And the reason why I say this is that I think about 2 to 3 years ago, we conducted a qualitative study, and we asked people what stops them from engaging police or prosecuting people who have been assaulted. And the myth was, staff thought that people can't be prosecuted because they were mentally ill, or police have discouraged them for that reason. Now, or they were intoxicated. Now that clearly is a myth. As a person affected by the incident, it's actually not up to you to determine the intent of the crime. It's actually up to the prosecution or the court. And so if you are affected by violence, you are well within your rights to report occupational violence to the police in the first instance. particularly assaults, attempted assault, property damage, sexual harassment, stalking. And before I keep going, I've actually got a list of what you can report. So this is an example, right? Now, legal frameworks differ in countries, obviously. And what I'm showing here in the slide is what we lean on here in the Australian Capital Territory. So we've got 3 legislations in place. So the first one is a Work Health and Safety Act that employers, duty of care, this is public or private health, have a duty of care to their staff to keep psychosocial and physical risks as low as reasonably practical. Right? The other act is a Human Rights Act that while patients have the right to seek healthcare, staff also have the right to a safe and favourable workplace. So it's always a balance. And the last act that we lean on is our Crimes Act that makes these behaviours indictable offences. This means that they can be reported to the police. And when we report, people can be charged, and when they're charged, then there can be legal consequences for their actions. The consequences can be they can either go to prison, depending on the crime, they pay a fine or whatever the court decides to do. Now, always remember too, right, is that if you don't report, we're basically ignoring the problem. And when we ignore, is we effectively condone. And that helps to normalize if there are no consequences for their actions. In Australia, we have a common saying, what we walk past is what we accept. And so if we walk past these behaviours, if we accept these behaviours, it makes the public think that violence against healthcare workers is okay and is normal to do. But violence is never okay. And so this is the thing that we really need to empower. And this is the culture the new culture that we need to cultivate, that we can report these matters to the police. Okay, and I believe that this is my last unhelpful thinking. So the unhelpful thinking is patient safety first. Might not be a very popular opinion, but my opinion is always staff safety is just as important as patient safety. Now, I discussed before, right, that as much as patients have the right to seek healthcare, we too as workers have a right to a safe and favourable workplace, and this needs to be balanced at all times. Because what good is the healthcare we provide if it is to the detriment of the staff providing that care? Okay, so as a parting slide is that I've shown you the iceberg analogy from a problem-focused perspective. So I'm going to give you some time to digest on the feasible and some solutions that have been shown to work for occupational violence. So obviously, for context, is we need to have an efficient system and mitigate these triggers as much as possible. The situations is to have good communication channels to communicate with patients about their care, and also a pathway so that patients can escalate their needs and concerns respectfully. And of course, for staff, is we need to develop our interpersonal and communication skills, and for patients, we need to strengthen the services that we can provide to vulnerable population groups, particularly for people with mental illness. Use risk assessment tools if it's available to you, and also use behaviour support plans for these people, particularly those with cognitive impairments, mental illness, and neurodiverse population. And of course, the social level or the societal level is that we need to have consequences for poor behaviours. And always remember that we can't have consequences if you don't report. It always starts with reporting and calling out poor behaviors. And of course, strive for low tolerance and also a good reporting culture. So I think I can leave you with that slide because that's one thing that I really would like you to remember, because that's a solution for occupational violence. And if you have any questions, I'm happy for you to drop them in the chat, or Kwali, how does it work? Can they say something?
Yeah, if you raise your hand, I can unmute you if you want to verbally give your question. You're also welcome to put the question in the chat in the Q&A area. So any of those things is fine. So I guess, does anyone have any questions or even comments about this at this time? Thank you so much to you, CJ. I really do appreciate just all the information that you've been able to provide us with. So, Ellen, I see your hand up. You can go ahead.
Thank you very much, CJ. That was very interesting and informative. And I'm curious, one thing that I noticed you used the word presenteeism. I've heard of absenteeism, but I'm curious what you mean by presenteeism. I hadn't encountered that before.
Oh, that is such a good question. Now, I too, before delving deeper into occupational violence, that's a term that I certainly haven't heard of before. But what presenteeism means is like showing up to work and still being counted, but not as productive, or people who are being paid at a higher level but doing lower level duties.
Mm-hmm. And then I have another question too. I'm curious about whether in your training, whether you ever use role play to help people learn the de-escalation techniques and how that works for you.
So in my undergraduate, communication training was an elective. It wasn't part of the actual curriculum for nursing. And in the first health service that I've worked after university, de-escalation training is something that definitely was not offered. So we did not have simulation. We did not have role play. I think it was the mode of learning at the time was basically didactic. And then we moved on to the e-learning. So it wasn't multimodal. No?
Yeah, I'm gonna ask a question while some of our attendees might be formulating theirs. So you did mention in this particular slide that you do hope that there would be good or even or better from the baseline reporting culture. So from your research, do you see a variation or difference? Do you see differences between you did show one slide about the continental, like more of an epidemiological snapshot of occupational violence across the continents, but in terms of the quality or the types of occupational violence experience, do you see like significant differences among continental groups or maybe cultural groups?
Oh, great question. And, again, that is really difficult to gauge because how do you factor in missing data, right, from underreporting? And so, but what we have been able to do is we have been able to theorize that, based on staff's qualitative reports, that they don't report because of poor infrastructure, because of poor support. And so we can assume that places with good reporting culture have a good infrastructure of reporting and they have good support for reporting. And when I talk about good support for reporting, is that actually something happens with incident reports, that staff are supported, there are consequences for the patients, and there are changes that are happening in the workplace when some of these issues are raised. I hope that answers your question, Noah.
Yeah, thank you, CJ. And I'm sorry for my ignorance because I haven't been in clinical practice for some time. But if you're familiar with accreditation agencies like Joint Commission International, and for nursing specifically Magnet, would you know if part of their standards or criteria for accreditation do involve or include at the very bare minimum a structure, as you mentioned, about reporting such incidences.
No, you really are onto something. And I think we could write to Magnet for them to include it, because at the moment they focus on ratios
Yeah.
and mortality, and as well as research productivity. And of course, I think they measure our nurses' well-being index, but I think it's a corollary of not only occupational violence, but like workload, patient load, etc. But yeah, no, thank you. That's a good seed that you planted there.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the whole conversation extending from when I first heard about this, and our conversation after the last seminar you gave, really did light a spark in terms of being more aware about these things, because I haven't been in clinical practice, and of course it's, well, occupational violence, regardless of the setting, can exist, and it often exists already. It's just that, of course, it's very different in the terms of how it's presented, how it's received, uh, uh, in varying nursing contexts. So thank you very much, CJ.
I think, Noriel, that was a really good question, and kind of built on something that I had been thinking about. Because I remember when you had that chart, CJ, that it kind of showed like high tolerance, areas. And I was wondering, like, how can nurses who work in those high tolerance environments advocate for themselves so they can receive the necessary support? If that is one of the barriers that they're facing, is that institutionally they might be in a high tolerance area.
Yeah. Again, another excellent question. And when we talk about tolerance, it's very reflective of the culture of the workplace. And what that really tells us is that there are only few people who probably could advocate for themselves and are probably fearful. I can tell you that in the Australian setting, one of the ways for nurses to escalate that point is to go through their unions. And we do have a regulator called WorkSafe that holds workplaces to account against the Work Health and Safety Act. So we do have those two pathways for us, so that our workplaces can actually put in risk controls in place, so that when we care for these people with OB risks, we can do so in a safe manner. And so we accept that, yes, occupational violence can happen, but with the risk controls in place, we can be prepared for it when it happens. And so when we're prepared, we're not harmed by any of the incidents that occur.
Thank you so much. And so I know we're a little bit over time. I do want to give one question to the audience just to see if anyone has any sort of last kind of thoughts. I know that CJ showed us a lot of information today. And so for those of you who are coming in and how you were thinking about occupational violence, I'm really interested to know if there's anything in this particular webinar that stuck out to you from what we heard from CJ about how you might be thinking about occupational violence in nursing moving forward. You're welcome to put any answers in the chat, or you can also just, take some time to really think about this. But I think it's always good when we get new information to kind of figure out, so what does this look like for us when we log off, essentially. So is there anything that stuck out to you specifically from this from the information that we gained? And if so, please just put it in the chat. Thanks. And then, yeah, I know for some people it's early, some people it's late. So The transcript for this will be like live for a little bit. So whatever you put in there eventually is something that we can share. And I'll also circulate the email alongside with any of the slides or the notes that we have. So please look out for those. And again, thank you to everyone who was able to join us here live. And, you know, we really do appreciate you taking the time to stop and listen, and you know, also for your participation throughout. So thank you so much to all of you, and thank you to our global committee chairs, of course, for all of your participation today. We really appreciate it.